Voting in the 2000 presidential race between Vice President Al Gore and Governor George W. Bush took place on November 7, 2000. As of November 8, 2000, the results for all states except Florida had been determined. The electoral map was such that without Florida's 25 electoral votes, neither candidate could attain the 270 electoral votes needed to secure the presidency. Thus, he who won the Florida election would also win the national election. On the morning of November 8th, the preliminary tally in Florida had Bush ahead of Gore by 1,784 votes. The difference was less than 0.5% of the total number of votes cast. Under Florida's election law, this triggered an automatic recount by machine. Problems arose because at the time, the Florida voter was to use a stylus to punch a hole in the ballot next to the name of her preferred candidate. The counting machines would reflexively reject, that is, not include in the final count, any ballots that they could not read, or that otherwise fail to conform to applicable rules. Such rejected ballots were referred to as undervotes. Undervotes included, for example, ballots where the hole was not punched all the way through, or where a hanging or dimpled chad made it impossible for the machine to read the ballot. The machines also rejected so-called overvotes, that is, ballots where more than one hole was punched under the heading for the same office, thus indicating a selection of multiple candidates for one position. Such problems caused the machines to reject as many as 170,000 non-conforming ballots. After the machine recount, Bush was still ahead of Gore, but by a noticeably lesser margin than in the initial calculation. Under Florida election law, this gave Gore the right to seek a manual recount county by county, which he did in 4 counties: Volusia, Palm Beach, Broward, and Miami-Dade. The fundamental task of the canvassers performing the manual recount was to look at each ballot and discern the voter's intent from the face of the ballot. However, there were no uniform statewide standards in place for determining how the undervotes and overvotes should be interpreted in the manual recount. This led each precinct to develop its own distinct guidelines. The result was wide disparity in the treatment of ballots between precincts. On November 26, 2000, after the manual recount, Bush was certified as the winner of Florida's electoral votes. However, Florida election law provided that the loser could challenge the certification in court, but only if he could show a sufficient likelihood that so many conforming votes were rejected, or non-conforming votes counted, as to cast genuine doubt on the outcome. Gore challenged the results of the manual recount. The trial court rejected Gore's challenge entirely, holding that Gore had failed to meet his burden of proof. The Florida Supreme Court, upon certification from Florida's Intermediate Appellate Court, reversed this result in part, holding that Gore had satisfied his burden of proof with respect to the results in Miami-Dade and Palm Beach counties. The court identified several perceived problems, the most important of which was that the canvassers in Miami-Dade had failed to count 9,000 undervotes in the manual recount. The Florida Supreme Court held that under Florida law, there was enough uncertainty about whether the undervote should have been counted so as to call into doubt the certification of Bush as the winner. Having so found, the Florida Supreme Court ordered, among other things, that the 9,000 undervotes in Miami-Dade be recounted by hand. The Florida Supreme Court also gave the lower courts discretion to order further manual recounts in other counties where there was a large number of undervotes or overvotes. The canvasser's task here, as before, would be to look at the face of each ballot and interpret the voter's intent as best they could, any defects notwithstanding. Beyond that, once again, there were no uniform guidelines for addressing the problems that caused the machines to reject the ballots in the first place. Bush filed an emergency petition in the Supreme Court of the United States, upon which the court temporarily stayed the recount and accepted review of the Florida Supreme Court's order for federal constitutionality. Bush raised multiple grounds for reversal, but the one upon which the court decided the matter was this: did the Florida hand recount process, which lacked uniform statewide standards for interpreting the undervotes and overvotes, violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution? The court's answer to that question, in a per curiam opinion, was yes. The Supreme Court began its analysis by noting that the U.S. Constitution commits the election of the president to the state legislatures and not to the people. The states are not required to allocate their electoral votes by popular vote. However, once a state chooses to do so, the vote becomes a fundamental right in the hands of each citizen. Therefore, the Equal Protection Clause requires two basic things. First, each eligible voter must have one vote to cast. Second, the election must not be administered in such a way that one person's vote has greater weight than another's. If, under the prevailing election procedures, votes are subject to arbitrary, dissimilar treatment between precincts, then the Equal Protection Clause is violated. This principle is called the one-person, one-vote rule. The court held that Florida's manual recount process infringed the Equal Protection Clause. The court cited several intrinsic shortcomings in the process to support this conclusion, all but one of which were frankly relatively minor. The one critical flaw on which the court's analysis ultimately hinged was that there were no uniform standards instructing the canvassers on how to interpret the rejected ballots. As a consequence, the various precincts developed their own wildly varying guidelines, which led to unacceptable discrepancy in the treatment of ballots. Consequently, there could be no confidence that each Floridian's vote had equal weight. Therefore, in order for Florida's recount procedures to comply with the Equal Protection Clause, uniform standards had to be developed and implemented so that the rejected ballots would be treated consistently from precinct to precinct and county to county. Having reached this conclusion, the court now had to determine the proper remedy. A federal statute, 3 U.S.C. Section 5, provided a safe harbor under which a state's certification of its presidential electoral votes would be conclusive for all purposes, but only if, among other things, any relevant controversies were resolved by 6 days before the meeting of the Electoral College. If a state missed the deadline and there was an outstanding controversy, Congress would decide the matter. The Florida legislature had made clear that it wanted Florida's presidential election to come within the safe harbor. However, the Supreme Court concluded that it would be impossible for Florida to implement a constitutionally acceptable recount procedure within the deadline. The deadline was imminent, and much work would have to be done. Therefore, the court reversed the Florida Supreme Court's order and stayed the recount. This left no viable alternative except to let stand the initial certification of Bush as the winner. Chief Justice Rehnquist wrote a separate concurring opinion. He argued that the Florida Supreme Court, by its orders, had effectively rewritten Florida's election laws, thereby abdicating the Florida legislature's exclusive authority over the state's presidential electors, as provided under the U.S. Constitution. Justice Stevens, dissenting, felt that the case did not involve any significant issue of federal law. He argued that the case instead turned on the Florida Supreme Court's interpretation of Florida law, which the court had no business reviewing. Most of the other dissenters agreed. Justices Souter and Breyer, in separate dissenting opinions, agreed with the majority that there was an actual or at least potential equal protection problem. However, both believed that the proper remedy was to permit Florida to execute a constitutionally appropriate recount, not to halt the recount for good. Justice Ginsburg, dissenting, believed that the underlying recount process, while imperfect, was at least minimally sufficient to comply with the Equal Protection Clause. The Supreme Court's ruling in Bush v. Gore had the immediate impact of effectively deciding the outcome of the 2000 presidential election. But the case sparked a still ongoing debate about the nature of judicial power and the role of the Supreme Court in the political process. If you found this video helpful, you can explore all of our content by visiting us at Quimbee.com. If you have a question or comment about this case, please post it in the comments area below, and we'll do our best to get back to you. If you think we did a good job with this video, please like, share, and favorite it. And if you think this video might be helpful to people you know, please share on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Google+ as well, to get this video out there. If you haven't done so already and you enjoy watching videos on this channel, click on the red subscribe button just below this video so you can get all the latest updates.